Carnivorous plants are among the most extraordinary plants on Earth. Each of the 800 or so known species evolved for one clear reason: to attract and eat insects, and sometimes even bigger creatures, on rare occasions, animals as big as rats. Carnivorous plants produce highly modified leaves, which form incredibly complex and intricate traps. They evolved over tens of millions of years, slowly refining and enhancing their intricate traps generation by generation. By eating animals, carnivorous plants get nutrients and minerals unavailable to normal vegetation, and so they can survive in areas where few other plant species can grow. And in their niche habitats, they can be very successful, and can even become the dominant vegetation. But overall, carnivorous plants are relatively rare across the world, and many species are found on just one or two mountains and occur nowhere else on Earth. In some species, the entire wild population may be just a few thousand or even a few hundred individuals. Take, for example, the South American pitcher plants, Helianthera. They mainly grow on the tops of the Tepuy Mountains of Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. These mountains are biogeographical islands. They have been largely isolated from their surroundings for millions of years. As a result, many of the plants and animals that live here have evolved in isolation, just like the wildlife on the Galapagos Islands. And exactly like the Galapagos finches, the pitcher plants here have evolved into many closely related but distinct species, each in their isolated habitats in which they occur, often in very small areas, and each with their own unique trap shape and structure. This species is Helianthera uncinata. It is known from only one small gorge. There are just a few hundred plants at this site. That's it, the entire known population of this species. A single poacher could completely wipe it out in less than a day. Fortunately though, Helianthera uncinata and all of the other South American pitcher plants live in habitats that are so extremely difficult and expensive to reach that none of them are currently threatened or really even impacted by humanity. But that's not the case for all carnivorous plants. The Venus's flytrap is probably the most beloved plant on Earth. Who hasn't got a childhood memory of being struck with awe and wonder seeing those magical leaves snap shut? And growing this astonishing little plant has ignited the passion for nature in the hearts of millions of children right the way around the world. But while the Venus's flytrap can easily be mass-produced for commercial sale, the flip side of this popularity and passion is that wild populations have suffered increasingly high levels of poaching, which continues to this day. And the rarer the plant, often the more sought after and more highly valued it's perceived to be, which often translates to an ever greater demand for poached specimens. Of course, there are many other factors that threaten wildlife other than poaching. But for high-value plants that occur in very small populations, poaching can be a real threat. It's a sad paradox that passionate collectors can fuel the destruction of the wild populations of the very plants those collectors love. For carnivorous plants, it's especially sad since most species can easily be propagated in captivity without any impact on wild populations at all. This film is not about blaming or pointing fingers. Conservation is about what we still have, not about what we've lost. But before we can solve a conservation threat, we need to understand the problem. So, in this film, I wish to tell the stories of two of the most imperiled carnivorous plants. In 2004, a new species of pitcher plant was described from North Sumatra. It was named Nepenthes rigidifolia in reference to its unusually rigid leaves. The type population was tiny. Just 24 plants were found, all of which occurred in a small habitat close to a road. I first visited that site in 2007, and several Nepenthes rigidifolia plants were growing at that type locality. I returned in 2015 to see how they were doing. So this is the type locality of Nepenthes rigidifolia. This is the place where the species was first discovered, and it's a very small site. The plants at least grew the last time I was here in 2007. They grew just up here on this ridgetop, but the only way to find them is to climb up. So let's go have a look. I spent an entire day searching the site and went back to the exact locations where I'd seen the Nepenthes rigidifolia plants growing in 2007. By the end of the day, I had found just one hybrid Nepenthes, a cross between Nepenthes rigidifolia and Nepenthes spectabilis. Sadly, every single one of the Nepenthes rigidifolia plants at the type locality had been poached. There are no plants left at this location anymore. A hybrid, by definition, cannot result in the reproduction of either of its parents. So Nepenthes rigidifolia is already extinct at its type locality. But that's not quite the end of the story. In the intervening years, 3 more small populations of Nepenthes rigidifolia have been discovered. A site with just 6 plants and another with about 20. Tragically, both of these locations were wiped out by poachers within weeks after they were discovered. Today, extensive searching has revealed that no rigidifolia plants survive at either of these sites or anywhere nearby. The third new population was discovered by Nepenthes conservationists, who kept its location strictly secret. Just one single plant was found growing at that third new site. I visited in 2018, and that single plant was still growing at the location. Poachers had not yet found it. It's a mystery why Nepenthes rigidifolia grows in such scattered small populations, or even how it can reproduce. But very extensive searching between these tiny stands has revealed absolutely no more plants of this species. On the basis of what is factually known today, this is the very last Nepenthes rigidifolia plant left in the wild. I really hope there are more populations and stands that haven't been discovered, but on the basis of what we actually know, this is it. All Nepenthes are dioecious. That's to say, each plant is a single sex, just like each person is either male or female. A single man or a single woman cannot reproduce on their own, and the same is true of this single lonely Nepenthes plant. Without an ability to reproduce, Nepenthes rigidifolia as a species is already functionally extinct in the wild. It's just a matter of time until this last plant inevitably dies or is found by poachers. Well, I've got to say it's actually very depressing coming back here. Just in a few short years, the entire population has been wiped out here. And it's very, very worrying because this is the only place in the world where this species is known from. It's very possible that it occurs all across these hills nearby. This area is very little explored. It's also possible that it occurs in a different part of Sumatra, maybe on other mountains. But the reality is until that's known, until people have factually gone in, documented further populations of this species, we have to assume that this really is the only location. And on that basis, it really does seem like Nepenthes rigidifolia is the first of the Nepenthes to become completely extinct in the wild. The second plant whose story I wish to tell is called Nepenthes Clipiata, which is known only from this one granitic outcrop, Mount Kalam, on the great island of Borneo. The first specimens were collected by the botanist Johannes Hallier in 1894. It was quickly noted that this species was unlike all other Nepenthes in that it had shield-shaped peltate leaves. Sadly, fires raged across the summit of Mount Kalam in recent years, brought on by severe droughts and people making fires. This exacerbated the forest dieback during the severe El Niño years of 1997, 2004 and 2005. Much of the summit is now largely devegetated and still littered with charcoal from those great fires. During the last 20 years, poaching of pitcher plants and orchids took place on an enormous scale and devastated the population of Nepenthes Clipiata, as hundreds of plants were ripped from their habitat and sold into local markets and internationally. A report indicated that only 15 plants were left on Mount Kalam in 1995, and it was feared the species was on the brink of extinction. In 2016, I decided to visit Mount Kalam and assess the status of Nepenthes Clipiata for myself. It's not an easy mountain to climb, but it wasn't long before I saw evidence of poaching. Well, this is a known habitat for Nepenthes Clipiata, and just 1 year ago, several plants were spotted here growing just on these rocks. Just looking around this area, we've just found some dead leaves and a Nepenthes Clipiata pitcher and some cut stems that have clearly been macheted. So it looks almost certain that these plants were poached just within the last few weeks or months. Makes me wonder if there are going to be any more plants up on the summit at all. So let's keep climbing and hoping. Yuping Ko, a Nepenthes friend, was accompanying me on this trip. Yuping had climbed Mount Kalam several times during recent years, and he hoped to guide me to several plants which he had seen just 1 year earlier. So Yuping, you've climbed Mount Kalam many times, and you were last here 1 year ago, right?
Yes.
How many Nepenthes Clipiata plants did you see then?
It's about 3 plants over there and 1 plant over there. Okay. And there's a big clump over there, and another big clump is over behind the mountain, behind the hills.
But they're gone now?
But all of them is already gone because of the poacher.
Wow, okay. So poaching clearly is still happening here. Plants are still being poached from Mount Kalam. Yuping and I spent 3 days of searching across the slopes of Mount Kalam. Exploring these mountain slopes is absolutely no joke. If you slip here, you slide on the granite right the way off the mountain. But our efforts were finally rewarded. We found 3 clumps of adult Nepenthes Clipiata plants growing amongst the vegetation, as well as 4 juvenile seedling plants. It's one of the most special of all the Nepenthes. It's unlike virtually every other species because it has almost circular leaves, and the tendril of the pitcher attaches halfway below the surface of the leaf, away from the tip of the leaf blade. It's really special, and really there's no other Nepenthes really quite like it. And of course, these beautiful cream-coloured giant pitchers. While it's wonderful to see this beautiful species in the wild, the reality that we had found just 7 plants over the entire summit of the mountain started to sink in. There are 2 main problems. The first problem is that each Nepenthes plant might flower just once every 2 or 3 years. And since different sex plants need to be flowering at exactly the same time, the scarcity of these plants and the fact that they're distributed so widely across the summit of Mount Kalam means that cross-pollination is extremely unlikely. The second problem is that each Nepenthes Clipiata plant is outnumbered by a ratio of hundreds or even thousands to 1 with other Nepenthes species, especially Nepenthes albomarginata, pictured here, and Nepenthes reinwartiana, both of which are very widespread on the summit of Mount Kalam. The much higher number of these other Nepenthes species means that when a female Nepenthes Clipiata plant does flower, it's much more likely to be pollinated with pollen from one of these different Nepenthes species, rather than another Nepenthes Clipiata plant. And this was exactly what we saw reflected in the fact that there's a far greater number of hybrids on the summit of Mount Kalam than there are Nepenthes Clipiata plants. Unable to reproduce, it seems to me that Nepenthes Clipiata is, for all intents and purposes, functionally extinct in the wild, just like Nepenthes rigidifolia. It seems to be just a matter of time until the last specimens of this species either die out or are found by poachers. Then the plant will be truly gone in the wild. It's not fair to solely blame local communities for poaching Nepenthes clipiata or Nepenthes rigidifolia plants. Poaching of wildlife is never that clear-cut. Sales are often driven by international buyers as well as local ones, and casting the blame is likely to obstruct meaningful future conservation work. That said, though, it is a clear fact that poaching of carnivorous plants continues across the world. I have visited many villages where poached Nepenthes plants are sold openly at the roadsides, such as this one. It's not uncommon for poachers to rip out every single Nepenthes plant when they find a new population, so that no one else can get there and collect the plants before they can. As such, poachers' stores can have hundreds upon hundreds of poached pitcher plants. The tragedy is that most of these plants were ripped up without their roots and will die anyway. It is very likely that many of the last specimens of those extremely rare Nepenthes rigidifolia and Nepenthes clipiata plants that were poached ended up just dying in markets like this before they were even sold. Just comprehend that for a moment. The very last specimens of these unique species, which took tens of millions of years to evolve, just rotting in a poacher's market. And when the very last specimens of these species die, the evolutionary story of these exquisite plants ends. All of those millions of years slowly adapting, changing, and evolving on misty mountain summits over generations and generations comes to absolutely nothing. That is the real loss that we all suffer with the extinction of every single species that disappears from our Earth. It's really heartbreaking to visit villages like this. That one just back there had thousands of Nepenthes, orchids, and so many other amazing plants. And of course, this is completely not sustainable. These plants are just ripped out from the wild, and the populations here are already disappearing. And if this were to continue, these species will just simply become locally extinct from these entire areas. It's a problem because also for the people, what do they do when the plants run out? When all of them have been poached? What else can they sell? It's not sustainable. It's not a long-term way of them getting livelihoods. And it raises a moral question because ultimately, these are just desperate people trying to eke out a living to feed their hungry families. And most of them are nice, honest, genuine, kind people. But at the other side of the argument, at some point you have to draw a line between conservation and protecting the plants in the wild and allowing people to make a livelihood and support their families. So the real question is, where do you draw that line? I'm not even going to attempt to answer that moral question. At a late stage in the production of this film, a series of shocking photographs emerged online showing a massive amount of illegally poached Nepenthes clipiata plants from Mount Kalam. These photos proved that there had been more than the 7 plants which I had observed during my visit to the mountain. There must have been a population hidden away on a remote part of Mount Kalam that Yuping and I didn't observe. But this good news was meaningless because of the mass poaching of the plants. It was heartbreaking to see these piles of poached Nepenthes clipiata plants, ripped from the ground with few or any roots and looking very unlikely to survive. It is not known if there are any Nepenthes clipiata plants left in the wild on Mount Kalam now. Soon afterwards, photos of Nepenthes clipiata plants for sale flooded the internet. It was pretty clear why these plants had been collected in such numbers, to make as much money as quickly as possible. And it wasn't just Nepenthes that had been poached. Unbelievably, photos of thousands of critically endangered orchids emerged. These were also being sold wholesale. The shock of these photos resulted in a flood of screenshots being released of countless other poached Nepenthes plants that were being sold openly on the internet. This is literally just a handful of examples out of thousands of cases. Many of these plants occur exclusively within protected areas, such as Nepenthes edwardsiana, shown here. This plant is found only within the Mount Kinabalu National Park, Malaysia's most important World Heritage Site. So not only were these photos evidence of illegal poaching, but poaching within protected conservation areas. The scale of this poaching is absolutely unsustainable. All poaching of endangered animals and plants should be condoned and needs to stop. But these photographs of mass Nepenthes poaching show an organized international criminal operation. The people behind this wide-scale poaching aren't sitting at the side of a road trying to sell plants to feed their hungry families. This is organized and sophisticated crime, selling thousands of poached plants over the internet using laptops, cryptocurrencies, accepting dollars, euros, and pounds sterling. This is organized crime specifically designed to rake in thousands upon thousands of dollars. And unfortunately, this is only the tip of the iceberg. While a lot of poached plants previously were sold to Europe and North America, the recent flood of images online indicate many of these plants are destined for countries across Asia. Local police in Kalimantan, in partnership with Indonesia's Environment and Forestry Ministry and the West Kalimantan Natural Resources Conservation Agency, arrested 2 men responsible for the poaching of the Nepenthes Clipiata plants from Mount Kalam. According to local news reports, these crimes carry punishments under Indonesian law of up to 5 years in jail or 100 million rupiah fines, which equates to over $7,000. The Indonesian police, the Environment and Forestry Ministry, and the West Kalimantan Natural Resources Conservation Agency should be really commended for their excellent work. This arrest sends a powerful message and is an important step forward in the conservation of endangered plants. Local conservationists attempted to save the poached Nepenthes Clipiata plants. It's not known how many survived, or if there are any Nepenthes Clipiata plants that remain growing in the wild on Mount Kalam. But this really is just the tip of the iceberg. Hundreds of additional photographs of poached carnivorous plants continue to be posted online every month. Just look on an online auction website right now. You will see obviously poached Nepenthes plants for sale. And the problem is, the emergence of shocking photographs, like the poached Nepenthes Clipiata plants from Mount Kalam, generates attention, but this is soon forgotten, including even poached CITES Appendix 1 plants, such as Nepenthes raja, that is protected by law through the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. All populations of Nepenthes raja occur within the excellently run Mount Kinabalu National Park, Malaysia's most important Wild Heritage Site. So this photograph of a poached Nepenthes raja plant shows that the poacher broke both international conservation laws as well as laws within Malaysia. Yet the selling of poached plants continues online. Indeed, if anything, the rate of poaching of carnivorous plants is actually increasing. This series of photographs shows the illegal poaching of hundreds of Nepenthes ephipiata plants from Bukit Raya in Kalimantan. These plants were poached to order. They were destined for sellers in China. No arrests have been made in this case, and it's not known if there are any Nepenthes ephipiata plants left on Bukit Raya. Remember, every plant shown here takes decades to grow and reach maturity. The population on Bukit Raya will take centuries to recover, assuming a few plants did survive. The poaching of Nepenthes is getting worse and worse. Just as this film was about to be released, in late 2020, this photo surfaced of a poacher who seems to have found a previously unknown new population of 3 Nepenthes rigidifolia plants. The poacher appears to be advertising the rarity of the species as a commodity, and even offers to poach the 3 specimens on request. What chance does this species have in the wild when it's targeted by poaching like this? A group of anonymous carnivorous plant conservationists across the world have set up a new website called CP Poachers, standing for Carnivorous Plant Poachers. Here, records of poaching can be permanently recorded. The goal is to build a permanent archive to show the scale of illegal poaching of carnivorous plants, and to highlight commercial nurseries and sellers that think it's acceptable to make thousands of dollars of profit by making rare plants extinct. Please report any cases of carnivorous plant poaching that you encounter to www.cppoachers.com. Please also report any commercial nurseries selling poached plants, so we can report them to appropriate authorities to shut down carnivorous plant poaching for good. The future of species such as Nepenthes rigidifolia and Nepenthes Clipiata, like that of many other endangered organisms, is directly in our hands. It is within our power to save these exquisite species and countless others, and it's actually not that difficult. But we only just have enough time to pull these exquisite species back from the cliff of extinction. In the case of these 2 endangered plants, there are many strains of Nepenthes rigidifolia and Nepenthes Clipiata that are floating around in culture in collections of horticulturists and in botanic gardens. If we do nothing, within a few decades, these last examples of these species will eventually and inevitably become lost, as horticulturists accidentally kill them or lose interest or eventually pass away. But if we assemble an organised, permanent collection, we can conserve these species and their biodiversity, even though they're already functionally extinct in the wild. If we act now and collect and preserve as many distinct genetic strains of both sexes of these plants, and especially the rarest species that are functionally extinct in the wild, we can keep hope alive for the survival of these species into the future. That is the Ark of Life project, to build permanent, organised collections to maintain and preserve that genetic diversity long into the future, and thereby rekindle hope of the survival of these species and keep alive the hope of their eventual reintroduction back out into the wild. For example, these Nepenthes Clipiata seedlings. These plants were grown from seed that was produced in captivity from 2 cultivated plants. The idea is that we can grow all of these up, keep them as a permanent collection, and that will ensure that we've got multiple males and multiple females, and ensure that we have as much genetic diversity preserved in captivity as possible. While it's imperative that we collect as many strains of these plants that are already in culture to preserve as much genetic diversity as possible, we also need to tread a fine line so as not to encourage any more poaching from the wild. We will focus on buying cuttings and divisions of each strain of these species that are already in captivity. If we keep this diversity alive, we also keep alive the survival of these species, and their future reintroduction back into the wild remains a real possibility. Imagine a day, 50 or 100 years from now, when poaching is brought under control, and these plants could be safely reintroduced back into the wild. With enough genetic diversity available, a replanting program on Mount Kalam could quickly re-establish Nepenthes Clipiata into the wild. And what is true for Nepenthes Clipiata is equally true not just for other Ark collections of threatened carnivorous plants, but many other imperiled animals and plants too. So why should we care if some of these little-known carnivorous plant species become extinct? Well, the truth is, the world isn't going to end if Nepenthes Rigidifolia and some of these other plants disappear and become extinct. But our planet will be the poorer once they've gone. These plants took millions upon millions of years to evolve. And within our lifetimes, some of these species will become extinct if we do nothing. This is an easily solvable problem, so let's just solve it. There are countless other animals and plants that are similarly threatened, like Nepenthes Rigidifolia and Nepenthes Clipiata, each with their own stories and reasons for decline. Just in terms of carnivorous plants, many Sarracenia and Drosera species are increasingly threatened too. You can help set up these Ark of Life collections to save the rarest of carnivorous plant species. Donate plants from your collection or money to support the Ark of Life teams, which are entirely unpaid and made up of volunteers, and they'll maintain these permanent collections to preserve the genetic diversity of the most critically endangered carnivorous plants. Most importantly of all, never buy poached animals or plants and report any cases of poaching to the authorities. Together, we can save these rare plants, stop extinction, and keep the biological treasures of our planet safe for the future. Profits from 4 brand new books on Nepenthes will be donated to Ark of Life to help safeguard rare carnivorous plants. Visit redfernnaturalhistory.com for details.